OK, so this was a question from yesterday that I thought would be better answered by this panel. It's kind of a hard question. And the question is, this was asked twice, actually, in different ways. The roadmap mentions GDPR-inspired enhancements. What can we expect from the AMP project to make sure an AMP website is able to fully comply with GDPR? And then I think related to this, I don't know if it's completely related, but how does the AMP client ID fix play with the European privacy law? Do we have to include an active permission request again?
Okay. So yeah, this is a great question. So GDPR is coming up toward the end of May. AMP already supports some of the behaviors that I think are going to be relevant here. You can, for example, display an AMP user notification, and you can do things like block ad calls on that. You can block analytics on that. So these are some of the behaviors that might be relevant. But I think what's interesting about GDPR is there might be additional behaviors that people are interested in. And there's also, I think, additional requirements that will come into play. The idea of sort of managing consent state in a more active way. So I think some of the things we're thinking about adding is basically kind of making consent a first-class notion in AMP. Because right now, the main way that you sort of can control these things is through a dismissible notification and just knowing what that state is. So I think kind of bringing consent state is more of basically a bit that you can read and set sort of later on in the page lifecycle. I think those are the kinds of things that will come into play. So yeah, and then relating to client ID, I think the other thing to say about all of this is, we can't give legal advice. And so what's interesting about GDPR is it's kind of on everybody to figure out how they're going to interpret the regulation and decide how they're going to move forward with it. So if you think there are specific behaviors that you need to see from AMP, please get in touch with us through GitHub and let us know. We're looking at the regulation and trying to plan for it as well as anybody, but it's really helpful to hear people's concrete feedback around how they're planning to address GDPR, and so we can really distill it down to the functional requirements you have. With respect to Client ID API, again, that's an area where we can't sort of offer the legal advice, but what I can say is, Chris had a really helpful presentation about it earlier today, and so for more details on it, you should go check out the Google Analytics documentation. And there are policies associated with using that API that you should take note of, and those may be relevant for you in implementing it.
Actually, while you're mentioning the Client ID API, there was another one that was specific about how to find more information if you're not using Google Analytics, if you're using a different analytics provider.
Yeah, so there's two kind of tracks of the roadmap looking forward. So one track is around opening up to other analytics vendors. So this is an API, and we are committed to working with other vendors to be able to make use of it, just as Google Analytics is making use of it. So for those vendors, please get in touch with us. And for folks who are relying on those vendors, please make sure your vendors are aware, because there's also work on their side to make sure that they're going to do the reconciliation properly. The other track is around opening up access. It's an API that's useful for analytics. It's also an API that can be really useful for other kinds of things where you want to know user state. And so it's called an API, and so we are looking to expose it as an API that people can just directly use and interact with.
Thank you, Rudy. So the next question I found kind of cool. It's kind of an odd one, but it's both easy to answer and shows the benefits of AMP. So I want to do it anyway, which is, why can't progressive web apps be more modular like AMP and load the JS modules you want and use JSON or something to control the way it behaves?
Yeah, I think people put PWA and AMP in the same sentence, but they're actually concepts on very different layers, right? So AMP is a JavaScript library that you can put a script tag on your page, and it has documentation, and you can just use it. Where PWA is refers to an abstract concept of behaviors and ideas that you can implement in many ways. And so there's just not it's the absolute other side of the spectrum of being opinionated, and respectively there's not such a well-lit path of how to do it, but you can certainly find, for example, there's the Preact starter kit, which gets you with a command line invocation something that's like a PWA, and I think there's a for various other libraries, there's similar things. So basically, that's kind of how you have to compare it. You can't compare AMP to PWA. You have to compare AMP to, building PWAs with library X.
Great. Here's one for Dave. Will AMP be served one day in Google search results for desktop?
Probably not. And the reason I say probably not is it's entirely up to the people in this room. So our AMP pages can be responsive pages. And in fact, if you've ever gone to the ampproject.org website, which is one of my very favorite websites, you should all visit it all the time. It's also the same code that runs on desktop and on your phone, and it's an AMP page. So it's completely responsive, and in that way, it is served from Google Search. It's not treated like an AMP page on the desktop because it's kind of rare. Most pages that people are authoring for AMP are really designed around the phone. And to some extent, that's not surprising. That's what the M is for in accelerated mobile pages. So the people aren't designing responsive web pages in general. So for search, if we were to send users to that AMP page, they'd get funny-looking pages on a desktop. So if there ever were large numbers of responsive pages that were out there built on AMP, then it's the kind of thing that we could consider. It's also not that, I don't think it's as impactful on desktop. Desktop doesn't have all of the performance challenges that mobile had, which is why it's called accelerated mobile pages in the first place. It's really aimed at the phone because it's a uniquely difficult environment to get right.
Thank you. Yeah, I think if I want to add one thing though, which is AMP for email, right? Like Gmail actually has support for desktop. And
That's true.
And I guess the reason to what you just spoke is actually that it's an entirely new part of the ecosystem that doesn't suffer from the legacy of just mobile AMP pages already out there.
Absolutely, and I would encourage folks to build responsive pages for that very reason inside. Both actually for AMP in general, but also for AMP in email. I think if you've built something for a mobile device that's a very challenged environment with bad connectivity and constrained memory and a slow processor, and then you run it on a super nice computer, its performance is amazing. So I like desktop AMP pages personally, and feel free and use them on the desktop yourself.
The way I do it, I always open Chrome tab when I want to find some news, go into mobile emulation, and read AMP pages there. It works really well.
Yeah, I had this idea for a demo that has like a column-based experience, to benefit from the small, narrow viewport, and you just browse page to page. Anyway, I can't tell if people are standing because they want to ask questions or because they're just standing. Okay, perfect. Then we will move on to some more questions I have here. Most of that user's content is behind a paywall. Will AMP Story support paywalls via AMP Access?
Yeah, I can take that one. So if you look at AMP Stories today, there's no monetization support. One of the things that we're looking at doing very soon is allowing for publisher-sold ads to be placed. And we think monetization is really important across the board. And so some publishers are really keen on subscription models. And to have a subscription model, you need to have paywalls and things like that supported. AMP supports those today on sort of regular AMP pages. And it's something that we are intending to get working for AMP Stories as well. I think there's some really interesting user experience questions. And this is kind of like one of the big benefits of the developer preview is we can kind of engage with all the various parties who are interested in this facet and figure out what a good implementation would look like. Just offhand, there's so many different ways when you translate the stories model over from kind of the way you see regular paywalls working. Do you put the notice on the cover page? Do you put it 3 pages in and give a preview? How does the UI present itself to kind of inform the user about a meter that's counting down or that they don't have any further access? So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions. And the good news is we have a framework already in place, AMP Access, that'll help us get there pretty easily. And so that's something we're going to look to add pretty soon, I think.
OK. Next up, are there any of Google's own projects, I guess, other projects than some of them yesterday, that are going to be rewritten in AMP? that will support AMP. And I guess this is not like a question like how to add it to a platform, similar to Gmail, but it's more about sites, I think.
Yes, so I would say it's like to that point, a lot of Google's products are more apps, so they're perhaps not a great fit for AMP. You know, with AMP.
What about Blogger?
Yeah, what about Blogger?
I'll keep saying one thing and then. So yeah, a lot of them aren't apps, and so you know, AMP just probably wouldn't be an appropriate thing. There are some interesting content experiences. So we have AMP stories out there, and something a lot of people may not have noticed, particularly here, but there's a feature in search that allows you to see like posts from some people. So there's Fashion Week going on right now, and actually the experience that you can see in that is currently being driven off of AMP stories, which I think is really awesome. So that's just one example. I think stories in particular is an area where you know, there's nothing kind of set right now, but you know, looking forward, I think there's a lot of cool applications for you know, content that various Google teams put out on the web to be kind of exposed through that format. So I think that would be a really exciting direction.
And there are some places where we do some kinds of content generation, Blogger being one of them. But we recently, you may have read in the news that we're running a pilot of a project doing local, tool to help doing super hyper local news publishing that produces AMP. So in general, you know, as Google's building new things that are producing web content, we do look to use AMP because we believe it's a really great format. And like the Fashion Week tool that we used in search is a similar example. Blogger is a little more complicated. Blogger is older than dirt, and I love Blogger. In fact, it's one of my projects, and the Blogger team loves AMP. We're all on the same team, but it's really hard for a platform that's as big and as old as Blogger to make a change overnight to kind of AMP everybody's pages. Some of you have built AMPs yourselves and have your own CMSs, and you can kind of know that it can be complicated to do just one site and something that you control. Trying to do that to the billions of pages that are out there in Blogger that's 20 years old, it's challenging. So the Blogger team is definitely interested, and we've been looking at different ways that we can use AMP from within Blogger, because they see the benefits, and for their users, they'd really love to offer that, but it's just a little bit of a challenge.
OK, I have a few more AMP stories questions. Actually, no, before that, one part of that answer too, because I just got myself reminded about one Google-specific property that is AMP-enabled. It's the keyword block.
Yes, our blog is in AMP.
So, OK, maybe not the most exciting one, but I just want to point it out. So next up, another AMP stories question. How will AMP stories with videos and sound affect load speed? And what methods will be used to manage annoying autoplay videos and sounds?
So yeah, I think one of the things that we're really focused on with AMP stories is how we can make sure it's really performant. It's kind of something that's clear after the fact, but when we sort of started on the project, we being a very media-intensive format, we quickly discovered that there's actually a lot of things that you can really do to get every ounce of optimization out of the implementation. And so that's something we've been working really hard at, and we're going to continue to push on. And I think the other thing that's highly relevant here is the caching piece of the AMP ecosystem, like the fact that you can caching and the pre-rendering pieces. The fact that you can bring both of these into play just have this, much more impactful effects in terms of how you can optimize the delivery of the content. Being able to sort of know, OK, this video is going to be playing when the user might tap on the story, and sort of being able to get the frames of the video ready to go, and being able to take advantage of a cache that just is optimizing and physically moving things closer to the user. I think those are going to be really important pieces that come into play with the Stories project.
Yeah, to answer the second part of the question was regarding autoplay video and sound. So browsers have recently aligned, actually about a year and a half ago on mobile, and then nowadays also on desktop, that they don't allow autoplay sound, both in terms of video and in terms of just pure audio. And so that policy is valid for AMP stories, and so you know, at least in when you consume it in a web browser, you can expect that it won't just, you know, play sound in front of your face. And I think the experience is also muted by default, right? Because that's just really the only thing you could do. I could imagine that if you put AMP stories into a native app or a web app where the, you know, just the platform idea is that, you know, just like when you tap on a YouTube video, you kind of want the sound to play, right? You can envision similar experiences, but like on the web, the right thing to do is to not, you know, play sound without, you know, explicit user consent.
Great. A question for Vamsia, I think. So with AMP for email, actually no, this is about authentication. So, but it's also about email. So how is authentication handled with email? What if an AMP email is forwarded?
So right now, I think identity is not something that like the AMP for email spec or even the Gmail team, I've talked to Akash about this, have thought about, but it's something that may come in the future. But specifically about forwarding the email, that's something that's supported today, which is since the MIME type of AMP HTML email is optional, whenever you forward it, the email client that doesn't support it simply just strips out the email part, the AMP part of it, and just ends up rendering the HTML or the text part of it, depending on what it wants to render. So this actually works in Yahoo today. So if you ended up forwarding a dynamic email to Yahoo, Yahoo would just end up showing you the HTML part.
Nice. Okay. Next one. Where do the CSS size limitations come from? And is it arbitrary, or could it increase one day? I think this is a very common question. I get that question a lot. Or is it a technical reason?
So we did just make it up, but I mean, we did look at a bunch of pages and how much CSS they needed, especially if they were created from scratch. And so I think the value that we picked is one where you can easily, you know, do effectively all styling you might want. There's a bit of a caveat here with like the desktop media queries that some people strip, and maybe I can talk about that later. But that if you do not, you know, engage in CSS hygiene over time, you will eventually crush against this limit. And so the limit really just has the, you know, the goal of making everyone, you know, perform hygiene, which is, you know, generally a good thing. And specifically with CSS, it tends to grow. I call it the Christmas special 2017 problem, where this is like, you know, you add it and it sticks around forever. And with AMP, you can't do that. So that's where this comes from. I do hear feedback about it. We have a long time ago proposed, but there hasn't been enough momentum to actually do it, both in terms of requests and on our side actually implementing it, to make a more complex version of this, where the limit wouldn't be in how much CSS you would have, but the limit would be in terms of requiring a minimum of actually used CSS on the page. So this would be a rule like you can, you know, you have a much higher limit, but that's only okay if your page actually references these styles, right? Which is the more direct way of saying the stuff you have here is actually what you need, and not some like old promotional thing that you've just kept lying around. I did see the Reddit talk, I think, no, the Airbnb talk this morning, and they said like one of the things they did to minimize the CSS was to, you know, essentially say, hey, here's media query, and because this is going to be shown on primary mobile devices, we can like kill all the ones that don't apply to these resolutions. And obviously that makes it really sad, and it would be a good argument to relax the limits, especially when it comes to mutually exclusive media queries.
Thank you. Now next, there's a stories question again. Oh, here we go. Yeah, let's do the live one.
Hi. I have a very quick question for you guys. So early in 2017, there was talk about a search live coverage carousel. And I was wondering if there are any plans to expand the search live carousel beta, or even what is the current state of that project? Thank you.
You said search live carousel?
Yeah, there was a search live coverage carousel. I think it was just called live coverage beta for a while, and now it's called the search live coverage carousel beta.
Yeah, we don't have any plans to expand, and I don't really have anything to add about that. It's a little feature that we launched. We wanted to experiment with it, which is kind of why it was in beta, to see how it was performing and how users liked it and how publishers liked it. It's still pretty early for us. We haven't actually used it a whole lot. We've tried it coverage in a couple different spots, but just don't really have anything to say about it.
Okay, now the AMP story one. And this is actually might be a question for you as well, because I'm not even sure if the rest of the AMP team can answer this question, because it's related to the Google surface. So when does the story carousel show up? Is it the same behavior like news when a topic gets relevant, or does it only show up when searching for a publisher name?
Yeah, so things in search, if we're going to be showing new types of content in search, we generally have a pretty high bar to cross, a high threshold to cross. We have to have a lot of publisher diversity. We have to have a lot of content out there to really make it show up in search, because we don't really want to show just one thing on the page, and unless it's just a normal link. If we're going to build a special search feature for it, we really do need a big, reasonable size corpus for it. Stories just sort of launched this week, so we don't have that much. We put something into search, kind of like we did originally with the AMP developer preview, so that people could see it, so they could actually test it with their site and see how it would look, and so that people could pass it around and say, hey, check this out. So we did a navigational query. So for the partners and people that have been building AMP to this point, AMP stories we call it now, yeah, AMP stories to this point, you can do this by navigating to like CNN, and you'll see it in there. Long term, again, it depends on the corpus and how it is used. If there's lots of people publishing stories that are on topic, and we think it would actually be really interesting and useful to our users to put inside a carousel like the Top Stories carousel, or even a special treatment on search, we'll absolutely do it. It's really too early to say.
Great, thank you. Okay, next, I like this question a lot, because it's not about Google, first and foremost. That's pretty cool. It's about another platform that has surfaced AMP documents recently. And it's about Twitter. So it seems Twitter returns AMP not from the cache, but directly from the origin server. Do you know the reasons?
So I think there's a list of reasons. One of the things that we actually support now, but didn't when they launched, was something very simple, which is that when originally AMP was created, we only had the carousel experience. And so when there was an AMP validation error, we kind of had to show an error message, because there was no real other way out. That's not the right experience when you have a single URL intent like you have on Twitter. And so, but they were like observing these error messages and said that it was not good for our users. Nowadays it's different. They just then redirect to the source instead of like putting error message in the user's face. Another reason is that, especially on mobile web and in the native apps, they would get if you don't have a more sophisticated integration, they would have gotten what you actually do see today from LinkedIn, that the direct AMP cache URLs are used. And I think we and they agree that that's not the best experience. And so I think that's kind of the spectrum along which they made this decision. Obviously we're not Twitter and we can't speak for them, but like with the launch of web packaging, I could imagine that they would reevaluate this decision.
Thank you. Now, this is about canonical AMP and about UI development in the world outside of JavaScript. Before, I guess we have what you announced yesterday, or teased yesterday, Malte. And this is about accessibility, actually. So are there accessibility concerns about building your navigation menu, for instance, with something like the checkbox hack when you're trying to avoid JavaScript?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not an accessibility expert. I imagine if you're doing workarounds for things, that there's an elevated risk of doing something in an alternate way. not familiar with the checkbox hack in particular.
I can answer this. So, I mean, I'm not sure why you would use the checkbox hack. It was definitely popular at the very, very earliest days of AMP, but now that there's AMP sidebar, it's really not needed. With AMP sidebar, you get the ARIA attributes that are required automatically added. I think, AMP's accessibility might not always be perfect, but it's something that we take a very high priority and especially try to ensure that things are good by default. So by using semantic components where you say, this is not, a button that has a click handler that, in reality opens this other field, but you say it's a sidebar, it has semantics, and so you can automatically express the right ARIA roles. And so, I think that my hunch is, although I have no data on this, that on average the accessibility on AMP pages, higher compared to the general web, because just many things just are good by default.
So I'm actually going to challenge a part of this answer, because I have a menu on my website that uses the checkbox hack, and it's a menu that looks so different that I couldn't use the sidebar for. But I think that's probably an edge case. However, I also want to mention there's AMP select and there's AMP bind that can drive many of those things as well.
Yeah, and like nothing's stopping you from adding the appropriate ARIA roles.
Yeah, that's right.
And
exactly.
et cetera, right? So it's like I think there's great value in not having to do that, but it's always an option.
Yeah. Dynamic mail question. So how is dynamic mail going to interact with spam filters? There's an interesting part of this question, which is in brackets, dynamic spam, oh no! So is there a way for us to know when we are reading dynamic mail?
So I think it's important to distinguish between AMP for email spec versus what Gmail is going to do on the server side. Specifically on the AMP for email spec, it's a reduced subset of the original AMP page spec. So it's, for example, you can't have AMP pixel or AMP analytics. So things which are mostly sort of analytics related are not possible. But that by nature is more constrained and is more sort of secure. So talking about the server-side stuff, which is, Gmail has got the best sort of spam filtering systems. It's essentially one-upping and making the spam pipeline much, much better. But also, one of the important thing is all of the requests that are going to be made out of a dynamic document are going to be gone through a proxy, and therefore, at which point spam can again start to filter and check to make sure, the authors are not doing anything cranky, and if so, just mark it as spam. I think your second part of the question was around how do you know if a user actually opened a dynamic mail? I think this is just a misnomer. In general, emails do send what is called like a 1-by-1 pixel with images, and that's how general regular emails even know when you open an email. But I don't think there's anything in the AMP email spec specifically that makes it worse or better. So it's no different than a regular email from that sense.
OK, thank you, Vamsi. So dirty AMP, let's talk about dirty AMP for a second. And dirty AMP, of course, is the code name for an AMP page that is not valid. So that's how at least some of us have been calling it. So is there a set of recommendations or advice for invalid AMP or dirty AMP or off AMP cache AMP uses? Is it documented somewhere?
One of us could take it. It's not documented somewhere. This is something that we've seen people do. They say, I'm already doing AMP, but there are just a couple things on my page that I'd like to add in addition, and I just want to build on top of the AMP. There's some risk associated with that because AMP makes a lot of assumptions about how your document is built. It controls what loads based on what's in the viewport, and if JavaScript or something like that adds something to your page, it could displace stuff, and then suddenly AMP thinks you're looking at something, but you're actually looking at something else. It doesn't load. It's bad for the user. But so far, we've talked about ways to sort of make it easier for people to understand what's going to break in the library, but haven't documented anything. right now, the best approach, the approach that I tend to recommend to people, and if you have, if other folks have recommendations, they should add those as well, is really just use PWA for these types of situations and like Shadow DOM. And that way, if there are features that you want to add to your document, it's in a managed way that works with the runtime well, that doesn't mess with any of the fundamental assumptions that AMP makes, and is a nice pathway to do that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The PWA AMP app shell integration is basically the official way to do this. I would say that, you know, well, first of all, I'm not a fan of the dirty AMP name. It's nothing dirty about it. Where it can be really useful is as a migration path, right? So that if you would like to port your entire website to AMP, but there's this one feature which, you know, might not be available yet, and you file a feature request, but, you know, it's not, it might be a couple of months until it's implemented, then you can, you know, use this to get yourself into almost the desired end state, and then eventually complete migration once you can. I think that's a super valid way to do that.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's a question over here. Yes?
Yeah, this is a follow-up. I think I'm not really asking, that was my question. I'm not really asking about going outside of the AMP rules, but serving pages off of AMP cache. And Twitter is an example of that. And a gentleman I talked to said that if the pages are served off of AMP cache, it'll actually return errors to you. And there's other issues, and there'd be some tricks to just make that a little better. And I think that's what the question is about.
So, I mean, I'm not sure I understood everything about that question, but like, I mean, you should definitely need to expect that people go to your AMP pages on your own server, right? Like that's where they live, and you know it's their natural habitat, so to say. I think one interesting point for serving AMP pages yourself is that we released yesterday the AMP Toolbox Optimizer, which gives you the same optimization that the AMP cache does on the content level for your documents when you serve them yourself, and that definitely speeds up load experience. So it's something I would definitely recommend if you get a lot of AMP traffic on your own origin. It's, you know, because we were just talking about dirty AMP, effectively these optimizations, so they make your document invalid technically. The way, if you want to see it that way, so there's these, there's essentially HTML transpiler. So the input is AMP HTML and the output is HTML. And the way we think about AMP is effectively you describe a document, and the output is a more efficient representation. And so this is actually an application of what you would call dirty AMP, where you, depending on the client capabilities, give them either the optimized version or the non-optimized version.
Thank you. So on the Toolbox question too, this is just a quick follow-up on Toolbox. Will I be able to achieve the same speed results than on the Google AMP cache with AMP Toolbox?
Same speed?
Same speed results.
Compared to?
The Google AMP cache.
So let's say you become a customer of the Google Cloud CDN product. or you host an app. Actually, even more correct would be you host an app engine. And so you actually use the exact same serving system that we use. And you can get pretty close. I think there's one big thing that you don't get and cannot by definition get is when coming from a platform that supports pre-rendering, it's not possible to do that without using the caches because of the way that the cache serving ensures the privacy of the users. I think we haven't talked about this at all. Like we've referenced it at this conference, but don't talked about it, so I'll explain it really quick. Basically, the privacy guarantee that we try to achieve is that when you search for something and you do not click the document, then the author of the pre-rendered document should not know that you, for example, made that search, right? And So the cache obviously helps with this, but because the publisher doesn't do the serving themselves, that vector where you would get the request and you would see in your access log that this cookie, was looking for, any particular topic is just not present, right? So and that's why the pre-rendering is exclusive to AMP cache.
And here's a question about components, about forms specifically. Why is input type password not supported? And is it coming? Is there a hope for it?
So I think right now login is supported through AMP access. So that's usually the path we encourage. There is an open issue around making input type password available. So if it is important to you and if you're not able to achieve what you need with AMP access, then feel free to comment on that issue. Let us know your specific use case. It is possible. There is just some privacy implications of doing it.
Thank you, Lisa. We have another audience question here.
Yeah, continuing on the dirty AMP, I looked at AMP as a great component set that you could use also if you have your first landing page and then come into your site, you can reuse those same components. Great example is the start and end date selector. I don't want to rebuild everything in my progressive web app or my website if I use it on a landing page. But as I understood, I should not mix it with my own, say, React rendering or other stuff. So what's the use of those more advanced e-commerce components if you have to stay on your AMP page?
Very good question.
Yeah, so I can first of all explain why it's dangerous to do that. But nothing's stopping you, right? So, and you can choose that you are willing to make this trade-off. And so the risk that is there is that AMP, for example, has one particular optimization where it assumes it knows when the DOM is changing. And so if the lazy loading relies on knowing where stuff is in the DOM. And so let's say a resource is configured, like AMP YouTube, for example, to only render when it actually becomes part of the viewport. And you use that AMP YouTube component on your product detail page. And your product detail page on top has a feature where you can expand the product description. And so the page becomes much longer. So now, if you're mixing AMP with some other technology, AMP no longer knows that this expansion happened. And now when you scroll to the AMP YouTube component, it might not realize that it's actually now on screen because it's in a very different place. And so that's kind of the risk. And again, you can choose to take that risk. But that's kind of where it's not compatible. And I think one of the theme of this conference was that ideally there's a good path for you to just having everything you need in AMP and not needing to do this mix.
Yeah, but I think that's we're not there yet, and we shouldn't go there yet, I think. But for example, the lazy loading, I understand. That's something you should take care of. But the components are web components, all the AMP components, I understood. And the use of web components is that you can reuse them in every situation, that they are self-contained. So what is AMP doing besides lazy loading? What other kind of stuff is AMP doing that will prevent using web components in other contexts? Because I understand the lazy loading, but other situations.
Maybe I suppose that if that's not, again, like if you think that you can live without the, or you can live in the context of potentially broken lazy loading, then maybe it works. From the top of my head, that's the major reason why there's risk. Yeah, they're just web components, and they will absolutely work perfectly fine in most environments.
Yeah, because your message in the beginning of the conference was like, we need to build all websites using AMP, also for desktop.
That's actually not our message. There was not all websites, right? Like
well,
that's
not all websites, but also your desktop website. You should go all AMP. But then you also want to move from search results, you go from the AMP cache and then directly into your real website, and then do personalization and all other kind of stuff. So then you would like to enhance on top of what you have in your AMP experience. Otherwise, you always stay on that one page that you get in, and your whole site is a single page. And that's for e-commerce, it's unacceptable.
And that's not actually, so if I can say something here, that's not actually what we proposed. So there's some confusion here. What we want you to do is to build full AMP pages, not full AMP sites. So the idea here is that you look at your overall site, investigate how many pages you have. There are some entry points into your site. And then there are areas where it might not make sense. Like it could not make sense for your checkout flow because it's really complicated. Could not make sense for your members only area. Or for some other advanced flows that are not entry points into your site. So the idea is that you could simplify your life by building those entry point pages completely in AMP. But it doesn't mean that you have to build your whole site in AMP.
No, of course. No, but then if you build an entry page with, for example, the start and end date control, and then you get somewhere else in your site where you also need a start and end date. So you want to reuse those same components.
Sure.
Yeah, I think like one thing that Eric mentioned earlier is that the infrastructure that is made available for the AMP PWA integration based on Shadow DOM can be used for exactly this purpose, right? So it is actually meant to be a way to safely integrate an AMP document into a more arbitrary JavaScript environment by isolating the AMP document into its own Shadow DOM. And so you basically use that to explicitly state where what parts are part of the AMP document and what parts are not. And this integration actually also gives you an API to tell AMP, please throw away all assumptions you made about where things are on the page because I totally put them somewhere else. And so again, like this puts the responsibility on you. But if you're then now it's just a bug that you can fix if something isn't working, right? But so that's definitely the solution for this particular case.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time. Okay, Madison, you want to say something to this specific one question, or do you have another question?
Oh, I have two questions, if that's all right. I think they'll be quick.
Okay, be quick.
So the first one is the AMP cache does some pretty cool image optimization, serving WebP when it's supported. And I'm curious with the AMP toolkit, or toolbox, I forget what it's called, is it going to replace images, and is there any service that Google provides that can do a similar image optimization when we're serving pre-rendered AMP pages from our own domain? And second question, is there any intention to serve AMP pages for navigational queries?
What was the last question?
Is there any intention to serve AMP pages for navigational queries? We've noticed that if someone puts in a search term with high intent that includes the brand of the site that they're looking for, the AMP pages won't be shown. Like if they're, for example, they put in Walmart and Walmart has AMPs, it won't show the AMP page.
Alex from the search team is nodding his head. Yeah, there's an intention.
So the answer to the second question is yes. Our intent is overall to show AMPs whenever they're available and they're a valid page. It's mostly true in search. There's a couple spots where it's not entirely true, just because we haven't gotten to it. Code is complicated, but that's about it.
I don't actually recall the first question.
First question, when we use the AMP toolkit, is
the free image CDN product.
Yes, yeah. Is there any, or not, it doesn't have to be free, but is there any tools that we can use to get similar optimizations that the Google Cache provides?
We would have to ask Sebastian if it's actually, and Andre, if it's on their roadmap for the optimizer toolkit to include image optimization. I think we don't necessarily have an intention to provide this as a software as a service solution, although I, again, think that there's probably some Google API that might actually do it for you, but you have to pay for it. But image optimization is definitely something where there's a whole range of tools, and they're all great, and the main problem isn't they're non-existent, it's just that people would not always use them. Yeah, and there's some challenges with WebP serving not being very easy and stuff like that. But I don't necessarily think there's a really easy way to make that simpler.
And I would just add that some of the image optimizations we do are because you all aren't doing them. So you can also just, since this is on your own origin, if you want to add, source set and you want to add better compression, you can just do that already today, and then our image optimizations wouldn't have to do anything.
It's really common that people like take a photo with their DSLR and put that on a mobile web page. And it actually, not only is this obviously really bad for bandwidth usage, but if you go into the multi-megabyte images, the mobile devices actually take a long time to decode them. And even though that's sometimes not on the main thread, because it just makes your device so busy, it can then totally jank the page. This is something we've seen a lot, actually.
So hi. So my question is about the whole monetization around AMP. So as a publisher, and also I talked to a lot of publishers, the reason they are not on AMP yet is probably due to the difference in revenue which a traditional web page makes versus the AMP version is significant. And I've seen it personally on some properties I work on, and I think this is probably a big kind of showstopper or a deal breaker for many people in terms of switching to AMP. So what I'm sure I do see the AMP HTML ads and the other initiatives you're taking, but what if you want to kind of increase the adoption of AMP? I think it's a big. I'm sure you're aware of it, and but I would like to hear your thoughts as to how are you planning to solve this problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. If you said this thing about 8 or 9 months ago. But actually, we've added a ton of features exactly taking this feedback from publishers and trying to, and you're right, about 6 to 8 months ago, publishers, even if they put in a ton of effort, couldn't have achieved parity or exceeding parity. But right now, we know of almost no features that publishers, any willing publisher wanting to put in the effort aren't able to sort of monetize at the same level or better. During my talk, I gave a few examples around India Today, for example. They're seeing plus 23% revenue per page when compared to non-AMP pages with fewer ads. And that's just one example. But again, the tooling is available, and as long as they take the tooling and implement the tooling, the opportunity is available to take.
I think we got to AMP way too early. Maybe in 2016, we were part of the private beta and the initial pilot. So I think it's probably we got on into it too early, and maybe things have changed now. But still, I think a lot of publishers need some convincing to move.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's all. Anyway,
now's a good time to re-engage.
All right. Thank you.
So we're way over time, so I sadly have to wrap up the audience portion and the audience questions. I want to give you all a final chance. If you'd like to say something you haven't said yet, please do so now, or don't say anything forever. No. I mean, you'll all be back next year.
Thank you all for coming. AMP would not exist without all the people in the community who've actually contributed to AMP, both contributed code, contributed ideas, and just been involved from the beginning and steering the direction it should go. So this conference really is about you, and thank you all very much for coming to AMP Conf and for supporting AMP, and to keep the feedback and keep the ideas coming. Keeps us all making the web great. Thanks.